Hello, critical thinkers. This lecture is going to go over causal arguments, which will be very important for your next critical essay. So, first thing that we need to know is what is a causal argument? Not casual, right? That's when you see that word the first time, that's like what it looks like. It looks like it says casual, but it's actually causal. Right. So when you write a causal argument, you are making a case that one thing leads to another. A leads to B. Now, it's not something that is simple. It's actually very complex, and there are often going to be multiple causes to an event. And so we're going to talk about what that looks like today. Now, here is maybe sort of a simpler um, causal argument, right? If there is an ocean earthquake, right, that can cause a tsunami wave to hit a major coastal city, right? That's pretty cut and dry. We know that the tsunami is a result of this earthquake in the ocean under the Earth's surface, right? And so then we can look at of that cause. So because of this ocean earthquake that caused the tsunami, there is damage to the city. There might be loss of life, there might be grief, there might be government intervention, right? And so you may have to make an argument, right, about what has, caused a particular issue in relation to this tsunami. Maybe it has something to do with government intervention and the appropriate way to intervene, something like that. So let's look at the purpose of causal arguments. There are lots of different ways that you can approach a causal argument. And the first is to get a complete picture of why something has happened. So think about the topics that you have already written about this semester, right? And think about what has caused that problem or that issue that you already evaluated, right? Each cause may play a different role. And so you have to examine all of the different causes and how it led to this issue or this problem. Um, and so there's something called near causes and remote causes, right? Near causes are things that happen like right around the issue, and remote causes, are a little bit farther away. So let's look at an example here. Let's say that you're looking at the issue of social media and anxiety. Maybe some near causes to that would be, people getting negative comments, right? That can be a cause of this anxiety with social media, or the anxiety of the number of likes that you get after you post something or immediately after you post something, right? So those are pretty close to the problem, right? They're pretty immediate. Now, something a little bit more remote that can also be a cause for this problem is algorithm driven reinforcement. And this isn't something that happens immediately right away, right? This is something that kind of builds over time, and it's a little bit more far removed from these nearer causes. Right? The algorithm kind of develops itself. And even think about, social media, how it's changed over the last 10 years or so, right? And how the algorithm has reinforced certain ideas or created certain anxieties surrounding, how you present yourself or things like that. Okay, you can also have a chain of causes. So if we're using the same topic here of social media and anxiety, right? You're looking at how one thing leads to another, and then eventually gets us to the anxiety. So let's say that someone posts content and then immediately they're checking their engagement. How many people have seen it, shared it, saved it, right? And then perhaps you compare with other people, peers or influencers or whoever. And so, because of that, in your comparison, you start to anticipate judgment, right? And that can bring up feelings of anxiety, that kind of comparison. So it's a chain of events that leads to the anxiety. There's also something in a causal argument called a feedback loop, right? Same topic here. So post content, check engagement. If you don't have the engagement that you want, maybe that's going to cause some anxiety. And so that then causes you to either post again or to edit, right? Have you ever seen this before on social media where someone posts something and perhaps like you're one of the first people to view it and then you realize it gets taken away and reposted, right? With a different caption or something like that. Or maybe you've done that yourself, right? Where you've posted something and you realize that you're not getting like the number of likes that you thought that you would. So you edit it, right? Or you delete it and you post it again at like a more high traffic time on social media. And so then what that does is that creates more pressure and then increased anxiety. So the anxiety kind of like of posting kind of brings us back to more anxiety. And it's a feedback loop, it's a circle, right? So when we're trying to get a complete picture of why something happened, it can fall under some of these categories. Okay, here's another purpose of causal arguments to decide who is responsible for something happening. So, who bears the responsibility and how much, right? Ultimately, that's what you would be arguing. And you would need to, in this kind of causal argument, you would need to show the degree of choice by the responsible party. Like, how much choice do they have in doing what they did to cause this outcome? And you also have to be able to show the knowledge of possible consequence by that responsible party. So whoever you're blaming, right? You need to prove that they knew that there were consequences to their actions, right? And so then there's this thing called the domain of the responsible party. And this is where your reader or your readers have to agree with the expectations of whoever you're arguing is responsible, whoever caused this. So let's say, let's use this example of a student failing a class, right? And you're trying to examine and analyze, like, is it the student's fault or is it the institution's fault? Is it the instructor's fault? And so you would have to look at the domain of the responsible party. What kind of choices were made? Does the student know the consequences? Does the instructor know the consequences, right? So what is the student's responsibility? Maybe they're not logging in, they're not turning in assignments, they're not asking for help and not using feedback, right? So is there domain of the responsible party, does it lie with the student because they have these choices and they know that there are consequences to the choices? Or does the domain of the responsible party rely with the school or the instructor? Maybe there are unclear instructions. Maybe the school doesn't have tutoring support for whatever reason. Or maybe there's some sort of miscommunication or lack of communication, right? And so these are, again, choices that could be made. And perhaps you would analyze, like, does the instructor know about the possible consequences of having unclear instructions, right? Maybe the student did everything that they were supposed to. They have documentation of it, right? So when you're analyzing who's responsible, you want to make sure that your reader is going to agree with the expectations or those assumptions that you are putting out there for the responsible party. Okay. Here is another purpose of a causal argument: to make something happen, right? So when you are trying to argue that, A caused B and had these specific events, you're going to look for a precipitating cause. You're going to look for the factors that push the event forward. Okay. Now, factors are different than causes, right? Sometimes factors turn into causes, or sometimes factors contribute to causes. But you would need to be able to describe the conditions of that precipitating cause. Like, if this happens, then it will move this event forward, right? You could also write a causal argument to stop something from happening. So, eliminate a factor to block a bad result. So if we're going back to this idea of social media and maybe anxiety, right? And you're going to look at the topic of cyberbullying, right? The factor maybe that is contributing to the cyberbullying is anonymous posting. And so you're going to argue that we need to remove this factor or reduce anonymous posting, and therefore cyberbullying will decrease. Okay. Now, a final purpose of a causal argument is to write or predict what might happen in the future. And the textbook says, we do this to convince your reader that all the causes needed to bring about an event are in place or will fall into place. And some ways that you can use this kind of purpose is to compare past event that has already played out, right? Especially if you're looking at like historical factors or historical causes. You could look at how this has happened in the past. But when you use this kind of causal argument, you will need to describe both the past and the possible future events to persuade your audience that there is enough similarity of severity. Like this event is going to be just as severe as this past event. Okay, if we don't do XYZ. Okay, so several different ways that you can approach causal arguments. So I want you to think about the topic that you have been writing about this semester and that you've already evaluated. What are the causes of that, and what kind of causal argument, what purpose are you going to adopt in your causal essay? Now, once you have decided sort of how you're going to approach your causal argument, you're going to want to think about some of these techniques and even be cautioned, because you could get yourself into a place of like logical fallacies, right? And we want to avoid logical fallacies in our own writing. But it's okay, obviously, to point out logical fallacies in other arguments. We just don't want to include logical fallacies in our own writing. So first, identify possible causes, right? So maybe someone has already written about this topic. You've used the library, the Coastline Library. You've done your academic peer-reviewed research. There are scholars out there who have already written about the causes of your particular topic. And you might add any that might be missed, right? You're contributing to the conversation, as our textbook author would tell you, right? And then you also determine the most correlation. So as I said previously, factors are not always causes, right? If a common factor is present, it could be the cause, but it might not be. Right. And so you have to rule out other possible causes in order to determine if a particular factor is actually a cause. Okay. Another technique, explain, explain, explain. Okay. Agency, right? This ability to show that something has happened, right? Depends on assumptions. And so you have to keep those assumptions in mind. You have to make sure that you're not overgeneralizing. You may look for, the motivation if it's a person, or physical forces if it's, not a person that is a particular cause, right? And so one tip for you, to make sure that you are not overgeneralizing or making too many assumptions that could lead you into a logical fallacy, is to qualify your argument with words like may or might if you feel like you can't fully explain the cause and effect. Okay. And remember, you've probably heard this cliche before. Correlation is not causation. What you want to do is you want to describe plausible agency, right? Describe that this could have been caused to show that the correlation is not random. And this is really where you have to like do your research. So please, please, please use academic peer-reviewed sources from the Coastline Library as you think about how you are going to write your causal essay.